Hello, today's Bible study comes from Acts chapter 22, and we'll be going 1 through 11. And it reads as follows: Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense. When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Then Paul said, I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison. And as the high priest and all the council can themselves testify, I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? I asked. I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting, he replied. My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. What shall I do, Lord? I asked. Get up, the Lord said, and go to Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do. My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. Amen. So, yesterday, when we were ending out of Acts chapter 20, verses 37 through 40, we knew Paul was about to speak to the crowd, but we didn't know what Paul was about to speak to him, what he was going to speak to him about. So today we see Paul starts his defense to the crowd. And Paul is testifying, if not preaching, a defense to the crowd. And Paul is straightforward. He says, brothers and fathers, hear me. And he starts it just like Stephen did. If you remember, Stephen started his that way. And Paul uses the word defense in his plea. If you look, he started off with it. Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense about why you come at me and claim these things of me. And he starts it off, and Paul just starts telling. Then Paul said to him, I am a Jew. I was born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in the city. I studied under Gamaliel, who was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. Paul speaks and tells them his pedigree. Hey, I was brought up here. And as they're listening to him address him in Aramaic, he says, I'm a Jew. I've been a Jew. And he spoke as a Jew to them. And then he put down some things that they all knew of. Because I'm sure they knew of Gamaliel and who brought him up, but Paul is talking to him and he's speaking things to him, and he starts telling him about his life, because that's how we got to Gamaliel. He says, I was born in Tarsus of Cilicia. I was brought into the city, brought up in the city, and trained by Gamaliel. And although he wasn't born up in Jerusalem, he was brought up in Jerusalem. And Gamaliel was one of his teachers. That's who brought him up. And he was one of the most known rabbis of that day. Gamaliel was known, and you can look back in Acts chapter 5, and you can see who Gamaliel was, and how everybody respected him. So Paul went right to who they knew, who they could even say they were comfortable of having knowledge of knowing. And then he addresses how he was taught. He was taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and he was zealous towards God. And Paul says he was a Hebrew amongst the Hebrews. He was the man concerning the law, a Pharisee. And he told you that later on, but a Hebrew of the Hebrews concerning the law, a Pharisee. He speaks of that on himself. And then Paul, to the smallest detail, he was following the law as understood by the spiritual people, the elite people, the teachers, the big time folks of that day. But then he tells them what he did. He said, I persecuted this way to the death. When he says, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also high priest bears me witness, and all the council of the elders, from whom I was also received letters to the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring in chains, even those who were there to Jerusalem to be punished. See, Paul was hyped up at what he did. He was great at what he did when he was doing that. That he was responsible for deaths. He was responsible for imprisonment. Paul was persecuting people. And he's telling them. And Paul said, you may be trying to do this to me, but I've been successful at doing it to others. So Paul was giving a confession in his testimony about his defense, about who he was. And then it says, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. Paul didn't kill everybody he met, but he did imprison them. But Paul didn't have no cut cards. He didn't show no mercy. It wasn't like he said, no, I'm going to just persecute men and not the women and children. Paul was at everybody. And then he says, hey, the high priest bears me witness, and the council of the elders, they gave me letters to do this stuff. He said, hey, your official leaders, they allowed me to do it. I got the authority from them to go do these things. So then when you see him, as he gets down to verse 6, about noon at this time near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? He brings it to the attention, hey, at that time of day, I was going to Damascus with my letters to do what I do, and there was an intervention. And a bright light flashed from heaven around me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, it doesn't say he fell off of anything. Sometimes we say he fell off of a horse or a donkey, whatever. It doesn't say that. It just says he fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he responded, who are you, Lord? Because he was having an intervention. He was talking with Jesus. He said, who are you, Lord? And I asked, and it said, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. When Paul spoke about he didn't come to Jesus the same way that the other disciples did, here's the intervention part. Here's where Paul came to him. And he replied, now remember, Jesus, I got to reiterate what he said. I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting, he replied. And Paul says, my companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. This message was not for Paul's people that were with him. This was an intervention for Paul. See, Paul didn't know who he was truly persecuting until this. And the message that was coming from the light was only for Paul. And you'll see that the other ones didn't know. It says, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. That's one. They didn't know who was speaking to Paul because it was just for Paul. And Paul said, what shall I do, Lord? I asked. And he said, get up, the Lord said. And this is Jesus speaking to him. And go into Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do. In other words, Paul, I got something for you to do. Now you're going to get up and you're going to do what I tell you to do. Because I already have it planned out for you, what you will be assigned to do. And Paul tells you, my companions led me by the hand to Damascus. Now, there's a couple of things here you got to get out of this verse 11. One, his companions led him. So, although Paul was blinded by the light, his companions were not. Once again, this was not for his companions. This was for Paul. Just as at Paul, suddenly a bright light fell from heaven, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice. When Paul was hearing the voice, it was for him. When Saul was hearing the voice, in case y'all getting confused, Saul and Paul are the same. When he was hearing the voice, it wasn't for his companions, and neither was the blinding from the light. My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because the glory of the light had blinded me. Now you notice his companions are leading him, so they aren't blind. Just Saul is blind. And Jesus has already prepared a step in a process for Saul to follow, because he says to him, get up and go into Damascus. First, get up and be obedient to what I'm saying. And then when you get to Damascus, there you will be told, because I've already told somebody about you. You'll be told all that you have been assigned to do. So by the time you get there, that person will be there to tell you what to do. And Paul is still testifying to me, and when he says, and my companions led me, because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. He had been blinded. This was an intervention for Saul and Saul only. If you notice, these things happened to him. He was the one that heard the voices. He was the one that became blind. And now he is testifying to the Jews that, hey, I was doing this all in the wrong way until I had an intervention with the Lord. And I'm starting to tell you about my situation. I am starting to describe my experience on the road to Damascus. I'm starting to tell you that I used to persecute Christians. I'm telling you, I was a Jew and I was brought up this way, and we have things of commonality. I wasn't in Jerusalem, but I was brought to Jerusalem and raised in Jerusalem. But this is Paul's defense that he is laying out to the crowd. Amen.